Hello, and welcome to another lesson of Initiation into Spiritism, brought to you by the United States Spiritist Federation. Today's lesson is number 23. Without charity, there is no salvation. This is based on the book Initiation into Spiritism by Teresina Oliveira. My name is Peter Hayes, and I'm with the Spiritist group Love and Light in Newark, New Jersey. What is charity? A lot of times we may think that charity has to do with some kind of gift of money and so forth, and that certainly can be appreciated. But if you look at the dictionary, the word charity, the primary definition is a benevolent goodwill toward love of humanity. And the adjective for charity, charitable, is to be full of love and goodwill for others. So, as we can see, there is a connection between charity and love. It's interesting that the King James Bible, which came out in the year 1611, was commissioned by James I of England, who was James IV of Scotland, who succeeded Queen Elizabeth. And in the King James Bible, the word charity is used frequently. But in more modern versions of the Bible, the word is substituted with the word love, not charity. It's as if there's a disconnect between the word love and word charity. But really, charity has to do with charitable love. And charity has to do with prosperity, with growth, with planting seeds for the future. Teresina Oliveira says that there are three general attitudes about charity. And the first attitude is really not charitable at all. It is, I do as I please. This is the attitude of someone who is still materialistic and selfish, and she tells us that there is no respect for fellow human beings. You could say someone who prides himself as being the rugged individualist in the negative sense of that term, in which they really don't have any regard for one's brothers or sisters, and they must have everything their way. The second and third attitude are connected to the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule is cited in every major religion and many other religions as well. The first or the second attitude toward charity in the first version of the Golden Rule is this: I do not do to others what I do not want them to do to me. And this is commendable. Teresina Oliveira says that the philosophy of the average person, it is of someone who has average spiritual evolution. It's good because it shows a respect for others, it shows a sense of justice, and so forth. But there is the third attitude, which is a little more proactive, which is, I do to others what I want them to do to me. Now this, Teresina Oliveira tells us, is really the philosophy of one who acts charitably, because it demonstrates not only a respect for others, but also a benevolent inner disposition toward them. It's as if it's in our blood, in our DNA almost, which leads one to serve them with a sense of unalloyed solidarity. In other words, solidarity that is long-lasting and is unshakable. When we think about, I do to others what I want them to do to me, this was a saying from Jesus in Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. So, whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law of the prophets. Jesus cites this in the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount is covered in Matthew from chapters 5 to 7. And if you want an excellent summary of the essential teachings of Jesus, then you could read the Sermon on the Mount. And in this section, he is emphasizing that we should take the initiative to treat other people the way we would like them to treat us. This is the more proactive approach, as opposed to, I do not do unto others what I do not want them to do to me, which is fine, it's good, but it's a more of a negative, prohibitive approach to the golden rule. But this one is a more proactive approach. What are charity and its attributes? Well, Teresina Oliveira, in chapter 25 of the book Initiation into Spiritism, addresses this subject by going to Paul of Tarsus, the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, the first letter. But before we get into that, I'm just going to share a couple of very brief comments about ancient Corinth. Ancient Corinth was occupied by the Greeks, but the Romans invaded and destroyed Corinth in the year 146 BC. At this point, this was during the first republic of the Roman Republic. And it stayed that way until around 44 BC, when Julius Caesar, not long before he was assassinated, decided to do a little bit more with the city of Corinth, and they developed it. Then, about 100 years later or so, Paul sets up his church in Corinth around 49 to 50 AD. By this point, Corinth was an important and thriving shipping town, a place of commerce. Paul's there for a couple of years and then he leaves, and then there starts to become some problems, which compels Paul to write 1 Corinthians around the time of 55 AD. Why? Because the church was divided. There was a lot of dissent about who they should follow. There were members that were actually suing each other and things like that. In other words, they were not behaving very charitably. In fact, there was even one member who was having an affair with his stepmother. So Paul realized that he had to address all these problems. And in doing so, in chapter 13 of Corinthians, Paul addresses the subject of charity. And here's what he says. Charity is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Charity bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Now we're going to spend some time going through this passage piece by piece. Paul says in the beginning that charity is patient, that it serenely perseveres in the willingness to help others. Let's face it, people can be very difficult. Sometimes if we want to be charitable, we run into problems, we run into roadblocks, and so forth. There could be all kinds of things that occur that may, even if we have good intentions, may prohibit us from doing what we would like to be able to do. But even when that occurs, we must persevere in spite of that. We should not give up on the willingness to help others. Paul goes on to say that charity is kind. That is, kindness it's beneficent only doing what is good. So he connects charity with kindness, and kindness is equated with goodness. Confucius, for instance, emphasized that goodness is what makes a neighborhood great. And Confucius went on to say that through goodness is how prosperity is possible. Paul says that charity does not envy. And Teresina Oliveira adds that it wishes goodwill to all human beings and never envies whatever good they are obtaining or doing or receiving. In other words, sometimes we see people who are doing good things and we feel a little jealous. Well, that's not being charitable. So part of this has to do with what's really in our heart. Are we truly happy when others are doing well? Or do we feel a little threatened? Maybe we feel a little bit like somebody else's victories are somehow at our expense. But this is not true. And one way of having charity is to do our best to try to surpass feelings of envy, or should we say competition with others. Paul says that charity does not boast. That is, and Teresina Oliveira says it does not brag about itself or the good it does. In other words, we don't go around broadcasting to the world about how wonderful we are because we help somebody. As Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6, verse 3, also part of the Sermon on the Mount, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. The Gospel, according to Spiritism, chapter 8, has the same name. Do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And one of the points it mentions is that if we are looking for accolades from people, then we're in a way saying that the approval of our fellow human beings and accolades and all that is more important than having merit, genuine merit with God. It's as if we are more preoccupied with the short-term validation from our fellow human beings versus planning and preparing for the future, in which we are trying to be a little more in harmony with God. Paul says that charity is not arrogant, and it does not put itself above others, does not judge itself better than all the rest or with more rights than others. That's Teresina Oliveira's comments. And what she's emphasizing is that we do not see ourselves as being superior in some way. We do not go through life acting as though we're better than others. Either when we commit acts of charity and then think we're better than others, or if we're just simply arrogant regardless of what the cause of it is. But we don't go around judging ourselves better than others. Paul emphasizes that charity is not rude. Teresina Oliveira adds it does not act hastily, recklessly, or brazenly. These urges are kind of a little more animalistic, certainly immature, when we behave this way. We must always, if we really want to engage in charity in our day-to-day lives, is to be respectful of people and to be not reacting to something quickly without really thinking. Paul says that charity does not insist on its own way. Teresina Oliveira says the good it does in thinking only of its neighbor's benefit and not its own. So we are not trying to micromanage our interactions with people, with our neighbors. If we're trying to help someone, we should be thinking about their benefit, their need, not our need. This is one way of saying we need to be careful not to have hidden agendas. And if we have issues with control and wanting to have, go through life with my will, my way kind of attitude, then it's the opposite of charity. But it's also, if we can engage in charity and not behave this way and not insist on having our own way, then we can begin to free ourselves a little bit more of that need to feel like we must always be in control of the outcome of what we are doing in relation to others. Charity is not irritable or resentful. Teresina Oliveira's comments here are interesting. She says it is not altered by anything in comprehension, slander, ingratitude, indifference, nor does it lose the pleasure of doing good for others. So if we're trying to help others, if we're trying to do good in general, let's face it, sometimes people may not understand what we're doing. People may misunderstand what we're doing, or they don't like it, or they feel threatened by it. They may slander us. They may distort what we're doing. Maybe they resent it by having ingratitude. They actually are annoyed in some way. Or maybe they just don't care. How often do we try to help others in some way and they don't say a simple thank you or anything? Well, it's understandable that these reactions are very frustrating. But Teresina Oliveira is saying we must not lose the pleasure of doing good for others. So even when we get these kinds of reactions, our capacity to be charitable should not be conditioned on getting positive responses from people. Charity does not rejoice at wrongdoing. while there's still wrongdoing and injustice, there cannot be true peace and happiness for humanity. In a way, what this is saying is that if there is injustice around us in some way, it bothers us. We feel that, it's not something to be indifferent to. It's something that we need to do whatever we can to try to address. And also, this can mean that we should not take secret pleasure or desire or secret pleasure out of the shortcomings of others or when people make mistakes, because we all make mistakes. None of us are saints. None of us are perfect. And so when we see our fellow human beings engaging in wrongdoing of some kind, it is a time to feel sad. It is a time to not gloat, but to feel that unfortunately this has happened. And can we maybe do something to change the situation? It depends, of course, but it's at least a way to think about how to approach this. Paul says that charity thinks no evil. That is, it does not condemn neighbors, nor does it attribute evil motivations to them. I mentioned the King James Bible before, which came out in the year 1611. In the King James Bible, the expression was think of no evil, which is a more archaic form of English, because the time of King James, same time as Shakespeare, was before the English language modernized to what it is today. And so the expression think no evil or think of no evil has been taken out in more modern versions of the Bible. But really what it has to do is we often get very cynical, or we live in a cynical age in which it's very tempting for people to immediately attribute negative intentions to what somebody does or says. And yet we need to be careful not to judge excessively and assume that everyone is out for no good, is selfish, and so forth. This does not mean that we're supposed to be naive, but we should not confuse cynicism with intelligence, because it's not. Cynicism actually, in many ways, is a distortion. Paul says that we should not only think no evil and be mindful of our instinctive thoughts towards others, but we should rejoice that charity rejoices with the truth. And Teresina Oliveira says, because this is the touchstone of all moral achievements and the basic good for all created beings. She is telling us that it is important that we be in truth, that we be honest with people. And therefore, she cites this passage from Jesus. Let what you say be simply yes or no, from Matthew chapter 5, verse 37, also from the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is encouraging us to be direct with people. When we say yes, we mean yes, and if we say no, we mean no. But when we say no, we can do it respectfully. We can do it from a place of kindness and courtesy. But really the point is this: sometimes people have trouble saying no. Sometimes people readily agree to everything, especially in the spur of the moment. Yes, I'll do this. Yes, I'll do that. Sure, I'll take care of that. But then we don't follow through. And this is something that's so easy for all of us to do. We make promises that we don't keep. But what she's advising us to do is do not promise what you cannot fulfill. That if we can all take a moment to remember, if we're being asked to do something, okay, can I really do this? Yes, or no, I don't think I can. But we need to try to be straight with people. Because if we agree to do everything and then we don't follow up on our promises, guess what? People are not going to trust us very much. So it is to our own benefit, and it is also for a courtesy towards our brothers and sisters that we rejoice with the truth. Paul also says that charity bears all things. That is, receive evil without retaliating, always forgive. This is really, really hard. Let's face it. When we are the object of wrongdoing, somebody doesn't treat us well, somebody hurts us, it sometimes can be very tempting to retaliate, or if somebody we care about gets hurt, we want to get revenge, that sort of thing. But we have to resist this urge. We have to find other ways. And it says here, always forgive. There's no time to elaborate on this, but the Gospel according to Spiritism certainly spends time talking about the different levels of forgiveness and what that really means. So it is important that we be able to try and forgive, because it has to do with letting go of feelings that can nag at us and keep us attached and tethered for a long time. Teresina Oliveira does add this quote from Jesus: "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." This is from Luke chapter 23, verse 34. Jesus is saying this while he's on the cross. And Luke is the only gospel of the four gospels in which he does say this. It is very significant because Jesus, of course, is suffering on the cross. And he has, at this point, everyone has turned on him. He has been denounced, he was tried, he's been beaten, tortured, and everything else. And yet he says this at this moment. Why? Because he understands. He, first of all, he knew what was going to happen to him before it occurred. He knew the passion was coming. And he also realized that those who denounced him, those who were the mob that was in a frenzy seeking revenge and all that, they really had no idea what they were doing at all. They had no idea what this was about. And Jesus understood that what was his entire mission was part of a much greater plan. So if we think about all the times in our daily lives when we don't know what we're doing, we don't have a clue. And yet part of being charitable towards others when they don't know what they're doing or don't seem to know is that we can also be charitable to ourselves. But at the same time, we have to be mindful that we operate with limited awareness, and therefore we have to be understanding about the behavior that others go through. So when others engage in wrongdoing, we should feel sad about this. We should resist trying to get revenge or cause harm back. Avoid eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Paul also says that charity believes all things, that we trust in God and in people, and for they have been created by God. This has to do with faith. And Teresina Oliveira adds to this that moment when Jesus says to Judas, "Friend, do what you came to do." From Matthew chapter 26, verse 50. This is the moment not long before Judas has Jesus arrested. He denounces Jesus. Jesus knew that Judas was going to do this. Jesus understood that this was also part of the plan, if you will. It is part of the overall purpose of the mission of Jesus, betrayal. It's part of the story, if you will. And therefore, Judas does this because he's a human being. And as much as people might want to condemn Judas or resent Judas, this, I think, misses the point about this moment in the journey that Jesus is on. Paul says that charity hopes all things, because within divine law will always have natural retribution, and even evil, if properly faced and endured, will result in good. That Teresina is talking about the way divine law will work itself, will work out the natural consequences, and that if we can encounter wrongdoing and then do our best to get through it, that it can actually result in good. Finally, Paul concludes with endures all things. That is, endures difficulties and pains, accepts burdens and responsibilities, perseveres in services and tasks. In other words, as Teresina Oliveira says, the one who endures to the end will be saved. This is a moment from Mark chapter 13, verse 13. And this is significant because this is right after the moment of the widow's mite. Jesus and the apostles are leaving the second temple. One of them admires how beautiful the building is. And then Jesus says to Peter, James, John, and Andrew that I tell you the truth, there's not one stone of this that will be that won't be knocked down. So Jesus is foretelling the destruction of the second temple, which did happen in 70 AD. And the apostles are curious as to when this might happen. And then he goes on to talk about that there will be nation rising against nation, there will be wars, and so forth, and that this is necessary. They are birth pangs, as he says. It's kind of alluding to the idea in the Spirit's book from the law of destruction, that sometimes destructive events serve a purpose in the long run that actually has some benefit to it, even though in the short run it can be very difficult and very painful. But Jesus also says to the apostles directly that they will be denounced, they will be beaten, but they should not give up, and they should bear witness to the gospel and be ready to receive the Holy Spirit, which they do, and some of this occurs in Acts of the Apostles. But then he wraps up this commentary to the apostles by saying the one who endures to the end will be saved. And we could think about this in our daily lives. Whatever difficulties and pains we go through, we're not expected to go through what the Christians did in the first century, but just think of our daily lives, the challenges we go through. Can we endure them? Even when we have moments of weakness and we feel like we can't, but can we still find ways to persevere? If we can, then it helps us in our spiritual progress. What about the need for charity? The third section that is addressed in this chapter, chapter 25, by the way. Well, Teresina Oliveira's commentary on this is quite significant. She says, it is by divine design that we live in society because our qualities complement one another so we can help one another. Without charity, in other words, charitable love, however, selfishness reigns in social life. Nobody respects or helps anyone, making life more difficult, painful, and sad for everyone. She is saying that it is part of God's intention, God's plan, that we live together as a group, a society, a community, a tribe, however you describe that, because we have qualities in which we can help one another, we can complement one another, and we can teach one another. And charity is the vehicle that can facilitate this process. It can, but if we don't have charity and selfishness prevails, well, this creates an unstable society. And often civilizations that are full of selfishness are not likely to last. Teresina Oliveira goes on to say that only by practicing charity, by being brotherly and sisterly and willing to help each other, will we be able to realize ourselves completely, both by developing the virtues and qualities that we all have, and by achieving a good and deep relationship with our fellow humans. Thus, we will also be able to build a better, happier world. She says that we have a natural ability, that if we can engage in charity, we are fulfilling ourselves. We can realize ourselves. It's as if we're hardwired. We have almost hardwired to be good. In other words, we have that capacity in us. It's not like it's impossible for us to achieve this natural state in our daily behavior. And it is so essential to improving society as a whole. And it's revealing that Teresina Oliveira wraps up this commentary by saying the practice of charity is an absolute refusal of pride and selfishness, which are precisely the greatest obstacles to our own and society's moral progress. She is alluding to the law of progress in part 3 of the Spirit's book. And it is question 785 that tells us what is the biggest obstacle to progress. And the answer is pride and selfishness. Now here, there's two types of pride. There's positive pride, which has to do more with self-esteem, which is good. We need that, a healthy ego, as it were, in order to function well. But then there's negative pride, arrogance, haughtiness, a refusal to look inward, and so forth. And that's the pride that's being talked about here. So when we're full of pride and we're selfish, that inhibits progress, not only for ourselves, but again, if everybody is this way, then society cannot advance. Paul elaborates on the need for charity by talking about this subject in Corinthians chapter 13. But what he does is he connects it to love. And what Paul says is, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. So he's talking about what's really in our hearts. I'm going to look at this a little more carefully and add some comments from Teresina Oliveira. We look at this passage. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, in other words, trivial and loftier things, but have not love, in other words, charitable love, then he goes on to say I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. But if I have prophetic powers, mediumship, in other words, and understand all mysteries, in other words, the spiritual life, something that can be hidden to a lot of people, and all knowledge, that is, if I have lots of knowledge of human science, and if I have all faith, maybe I have total conviction of the reality of spiritual facts. Well, all of that's great. And what if I also have, my faith can help remove mountains, figuratively speaking, but have not love, I am nothing. So having all these attributes is fine, but if we don't have love, then it doesn't count for much. If I give away all I have, in other words, material charity, sell all your possessions and all that, and I deliver up my body to be burned, a public testimony of faith, like the ones later given by the martyrs of Christianity, but have not love, I am nothing. So if we go to all this sacrifice, but we don't really have love in our hearts, there isn't much merit in it. Paul is emphasizing that charity must come from a genuine place, and that is love. Paul's message reaffirms what was already written in the Old Testament and what Jesus stressed when he said, you shall love God and your neighbor as yourself. That was Jesus sort of taking the 10 Commandments and boiling it down to this essential point. You shall love God and your neighbor as yourself. And then Paul wraps up this commentary in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 by saying charity must come from a genuine place, and that is love. But he also says that no one loves God without loving neighbor. That is, we can't profess to love God, but then we don't like our neighbor very much. There's a contradiction there because our neighbors are God's creation, just as we are God's creation. So if we truly say we love God, that means we love our fellow brothers and sisters as well. And then Paul wraps up by saying, so now faith, hope, and love abide. In other words, they endure, they're long-lasting. These three. But the greatest of these is love. And this leads to Spiritism's motto, one of Spiritism's main mottos. Without charity, there is no salvation. Again, charity meaning charitable love, and salvation is our spiritual progress. The final section in this chapter, without charity, how to practice charity. Well, there are generally two kinds of charity. There's material charity and there's moral charity. With material charity, it is obviously practice using material things, and this can be very beneficial, and depending on the circumstances, it can be a wonderful thing to do. But really, when we think about material charity, Teresina Oliveira is reminding us that we also need to look at our intentions and the circumstances under which we engage in material charity. For instance, if we're only giving what is superfluous to us, then maybe it's not so heartfelt, as it were, and it might be more of a duty, an obligation of some kind. Well, okay, it's not really charity, though. And then she says, to give for the sake of some interest is not charity. In other words, if we are charitable towards somebody, we help them out, but we really want something in return, that's not charity. That's really, it's a bargaining. It's an exchange. Now, there may be certain circumstances where that's fine, but we shouldn't confuse this exchange, I help you if you help me back. We shouldn't confuse that with charity. There may be times, again, where doing this is fine, but again, do not confuse it with charity. When we really want to help or please someone in accordance with charitable feeling, we give even what is not superfluous to us. We give what is necessary to us and even what we cannot afford to give. This is where, if we're going to engage in material charity, it's a little more of a sacrifice, if you will. And one example, of course, is a famous one, the widow's offering, or better known as the widow's mite. Jesus and the apostles, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, again, are outside the second temple, or at the second temple, and they're watching people throwing money into the tip to support the second temple, and they're giving out of their excess. And then this woman shows up, a widow, and she throws in 2 mites, which is worth like a fraction of a penny. It's virtually nothing, but it was all she had. And Jesus watches her and says to the apostles, I tell you, this woman gave more than all the others combined, because they gave out of their abundance, but she gave everything that she had. Maybe she wasn't going to eat that night. And so in doing this gesture, this woman was making more of a personal sacrifice. And that is one of the qualities of material charity that can go even further in terms of having merit. But when we think about material charity, that's not the only approach to it, of course. What we need to also be very mindful about is that when we engage in material charity, that we make sure we're not humiliating anybody, that it's advisable to give someone or add some gentle words to someone, a smile, a vibration of love. In other words, encourage them. Be kind to those people. Don't make them feel like I'm doing you a favor, that kind of thing. And if possible, try to make the needy person feel as if they're able to produce something in return. In other words, we need to go make sure we preserve their dignity. There is a charitable organization called Heifer International. And what they do is they go into parts of the world that are where people are struggling. And what they donate are livestock. And what they do in doing so is they're helping people to empower themselves. So they may donate a cow to somebody, and that person can take the cow, milk it, sell the milk, and earn a living. And so they're giving people a chance to produce something in return. They're increasing their dignity, their self-esteem, and so forth. But also, this is a kind of material charity in which they are planting seeds for the future and hopefully helping people to help themselves, who then in turn may help others as well. Now, moral charity. Moral charity is different from material charity for one very big important reason. First of all, you don't need to have money to engage in moral charity. Anyone can practice it because everyone can give of themselves. When they give of themselves, they can give of their time, of their work, of their knowledge, of their intelligence or skills, of their attention, of their tolerance, of their indulgence, of their forgiveness, of their consolation, of their support, sympathy, pleasantness, counseling, and love. These are all gifts that we have, all attributes that we have. And they are based on giving of our time. We can share our knowledge with people. We can share our intelligence and skills, all kinds of things. We are going out of our way for somebody. And when we do this, people often benefit more in many ways, because this is similar in a different way, but it's similar to what I just said about Heifer International. It is the type of charity in which we may be helping people in ways that are much longer lasting. There may be instances in which we're empowering people, helping people to help themselves, and so forth. And so, and also it demonstrates that we care. It demonstrates whenever we make time for someone in some way, shape, or form, it is a demonstration of compassion. You could say that it summarizes many of the attributes that were described before. And the practice of moral charity, the practice of any virtue for the benefit of others, is charity. And it is also charity in the highest degree to help one to find their own balance, develop, and become materially or spiritually self-sufficient. This is how Teresina Oliveira concludes this chapter. And then she makes a final brief gesture, which I rephrased a little bit, which is this. It's a well-known parable or saying. Give someone a fish and you feed for a day. Teach someone to fish and you feed for a lifetime. So this is an example in which we engage in charity that is about helping others, and in helping others with the use of our time by sharing our gifts freely, I should say, our emotional gifts, for instance, that we're able to help plant seeds for the future. We're able to do our little part in making society stronger, more stable, and more happy. And imagine if more and more people everywhere engage in this practice. Can you imagine the changes and the transformation that will occur? Thank you. Now, I believe we have some questions. How can I be charitable with people who really get on my nerves? Well, it's not very easy. That's certainly true. But as mentioned, we have to learn how to endure all things, bear all things. We also have to learn how to be patient. These are all charitable qualities. And it may take some effort. And we may not succeed right away. We may have trouble because there are people who press our buttons, as it were. But if we start to be more mindful of how we can change the way we react, we can begin to look inward. We can ask ourselves, why does this person get on my nerves? Is it really that important, the way they get on my nerves? Well, we can't always change the behavior of others, but we can certainly work on how we process the way we respond to it. Okay, let's see if there's another question. How do we know if our charity will count? One way in which we can know is that when we engage in acts of charity, we're not keeping score. In other words, we help someone and they appreciate it or they don't appreciate it, but whatever the response is, we help and then we move on and we let it go and we don't think about it anymore. And when we can begin to engage in charity this way, then we're not doing it with any conditions attached. So it's not also about how much we go out and help this person and help that person and do this and do that. A lot of it also has to do with even just how we react to events around us. If there is some injustice going on, are we one of those that's calling for that perpetrator to be harmed in some way? Or are we sad for that perpetrator? Are we praying for that perpetrator? Are we also praying for those who are the object of the suffering? Are we engaging in efforts to try to help in some way? There are lots of examples that one could go into, but just very quickly, if we have some kind of major event going on like we do now, in which there's a lot of injustice going on, there are lots of ways to respond. One is to want to seek revenge and retribution. The other is to support efforts to help. If we support efforts to help, that's an effort of charity. think about the ways in which we can work for the good, not in ways in which we can try to get even with people. Okay, see if there's another question. How can I be charitable when I am really in need of charity myself? Okay, well, suppose we are suffering a lot emotionally or we're suffering physically. Obviously, that can make it difficult for us to engage in charity towards others, but it doesn't mean we can't do anything. Even if we're ill, can we still pray for people, for instance? Maybe we can engage in some kind of kind words. We can also, if we're suffering a great deal ourselves, remember that moment of Jesus on the cross. He was suffering, yet he says, Father, forgive them, they know not what they're doing. He was thinking about others, not so much himself. Now, there are times when we need to take care of ourselves, of course, but even when we're going through challenges like that, physical challenge, emotional challenges, and so forth, can we at least also think about others while we're also going through the difficulties that we're going through? And the more we can do that, the more we can begin to do more than maybe we think we could do. Okay. All right. We are now out of time. I would like to thank all of you for listening. I will be back for another lesson. It's based on chapter 36, the parable of the lamp under the basket. And I hope you have enjoyed this lesson, and I hope that you will share all of the lessons from the Initiation into Spiritism series with others. And again, as a reminder, these lessons are for those who are brand new to Spiritism, but also for those who studied Spiritism for a while, because often we encounter things that either reinforce what we know, or there may be some details that we hadn't thought about so much before. But either way, I hope you enjoy this. Thank you for listening, and many blessings.